Hi everyone, Mark Brownlee back for episode 4 of the Mackerel story course here at myengineerexchange.com. This week we're talking about delivery. If you want a quick bio on me, by the way, jump back into episode 1. There's some stuff there because we're going to jump straight into this one on delivery. I'll get there in a second. First though, last week you'll remember we talked about trust, and just a quick recap. Here's the trust box that I use whenever I talk about trust in the life of a professional engineer, either with young engineers or graduates, even experienced engineers sometimes. And I always say you want to stay in the keeper quadrant. Don't be a gunner, a destroyer, or a scammer. Make the commitments and deliver on them. So that was last week. This week, though, I want to get on to delivery, because delivery is basically everything. It is what your career is built on or not. And in simple terms, it's really just the ability to get things done. But this time it's giving everyone, which includes your boss, the team, your company, the client, the customer, the confidence that you can make the pass, not just take the pass, which is what we covered back in trust last week. Okay, so I've said many times Mackerel was a complex job, and it's also a complex beast. So it's a rig sitting in the middle of Bass Strait extracting oil and gas. So it's a technological marvel in that sense, but it's also a money-making machine for, as it was back then, SOBHP. And that really meant that I had two tasks. One was to confirm the business requirements, but also the functional and technical requirements that an engineer has to be all over. And for a money-making machine like Mackerel, if you get the last two right, that's functional and technical, the first usually follows. But to do that, I really needed to understand the commercial context in which Mackerel operated. It was important to me and really reinforced, when I think about it, my fourth year elective in business finance. So as I always say, hint, hint, if you're an engineer, jump onto some finance subjects, either as a double degree or take them as electives. They come in really, really handy. I remember about conversations actually on Mackerel about the value of the barrels of oil and the cubic meters of gas that were being piped back to Longford. So I really got into the money-making side, the business side, the commercial side of what Mackerel did. In fact, I even documented the scale of production, the value, the job cost, the budget from the client side, and also from my side, so that I could include all of that and understand the total context of spend and resources. In simple terms, I guess it was like a project manifesto that I created, and I'd encourage all of you to do exactly the same thing. Up front, what we didn't do was start coding. Strange, isn't it? We didn't start coding. It was really about understanding the context in which the code would be written. The functional and technical specifications, of course, were next, after the business requirements were understood. The technical was pretty clear, so functionally we needed to put some more emphasis on that. And what actually happened on the rig as a result of the code sequences, and what was their significance, they were the things we were focused on in the context of Mackerel's overall operations. So the approach I took was kind of like an energy and mass balance that most chemical engineers, in fact all chemical engineers, will be familiar with. And so I built context around the functional requirements, starting with the system as a whole. In other words, what does the platform do and how does it do it? And then in the finest tradition of systems engineers, the subsystems that I was coding had context and the interdependencies were clearly specified. So we got a total picture of the job. I then knew what was happening upstream and downstream, and what that did was give me a much broader array of contingencies to code against and properly define the failure mode, which was critically important in the oil and gas environment. So the rig was a system, and there were lots of subsystems, including the disposal pile that I was responsible for. It wasn't the other way around. So you always need to understand the system implications of your coding. I guess that's what I'm saying, not just the logic gates and the successful execution of lines of code, but in Mackerel's case, the physical movement of oil and gas around the platform and under what circumstances it's moving that your code actually enables. A military analogy might be that the field commander has a total picture or a complete picture of the battlefield, and that's where the commander is actually you. But ultimately, your success is determined by whether the system performs as intended. If you want to delve a little deeper on that, I've got a little chart that I often refer back to when I'm talking about this stuff in public. And it's really the simple life cycle of project delivery or completion. And this is what it looks like in my mind. It's kind of like an earned value take on delivery. You can see this one's actually linear, just to simplify the example. A lot of people get confused and think projects are about time and about money, which they are. But when the time and the money are exhausted on any project, it must perform, the system must perform as specified. If it doesn't, then you haven't delivered. So what I'd like you to do is think of money as the third dimension, if you like. It's critical, but clients are going to be desperately unhappy if they don't get what they're expecting and you've agreed to deliver. You can break your project up into logical milestones. I mean, for simplicity here, I've used quartiles, but you get the point. The bottom line is the project doesn't complete until all the outstanding requirements have been fulfilled, and then make sure you check them. And I'll tell you how we did that on Mackerel in a minute. The other thing about projects in a delivery context is that they develop an operating tempo or rhythm. It's really a function of leadership, governance, but also the project context that we talked a lot about in episode 2. And I really recommend you go back and study that. Get a feel for the context and the project drivers and complications so you can adjust your work rate accordingly. You don't want to compromise the project's critical path by not being able to deliver or deliver in accordance with the tempo that's been established for the project. Mackerel, as I've said, was time constrained. Once I landed, I had a day and a half to commission the disposal pile. But I actually spent ages back on dry land in Abbotsford mapping my lines of code onto the functional and technical requirements, so I knew exactly what devices were operating under what conditions. The planning phase was elongated, of course, because we were facing a 36-hour hard limit on the execution phase, so we had to get the planning right and we had time to do that, and that's what I'd encourage you to do always. Now, the best engineers, I would say, practice technically, but they think functionally about what the system's actually going to do and the benefits that the client or customer derives. And those engineers are in constant motion, either planning, briefing, executing, or debriefing. The best engineers are constantly in motion in any one of the 4 project phases that, as I've said in the opening, fighter pilots call the flex or flawless execution methodology. For a 90% or greater success rate, just like the fighter pilot community, every one of your actions on a project needs to fit neatly into one of those 4 phases you can see on the screen, the 4 key phases of the project lifecycle. If you can't clearly assign a project action to one of those 4 boxes, it isn't adding much value at all. In the case of Mackerel, when problems arose, which they inevitably did, I needed to be able to go back to the lines of code that were responsible. I was the only one from Honeywell on the rig. Honeywell was a multi-billion-dollar multinational, but when it came down to it, I was Honeywell. On that rig, if they couldn't start up, I'd let every Honeywell employee in the world down. And I'm not kidding about that. That's what's at stake when you go to site wearing a safety helmet with your company logo on the front. You are the company. You've got to take responsibility, or on Mackerel, as we said, own the code. And taking responsibility is more than just a moral assertion. It's more than just saying you're going to be responsible. It means developing a detailed understanding of the system you're responsible for, including its functional and technical performance, not just the successful execution of the lines of code. And it's also about fessing up when you stuff up. Remember the last episode on trust? If you stuff up, fess up. It gives the client and the customer and your project team members confidence, and it builds trust. But ultimately, it's about developing a bias for action and taking responsibility. Okay, so trust me on this. As an engineering executive with about 30 years experience, you can never rely on something happening just because you've taken a decision, compiled and executed some code, in my case, issued an instruction, or set in train a series of executables. You might be lucky once or twice, but don't push it. You're going to need evidence or proof, or what we call verification. It was the same on Mackerel. There were multiple code changes over that day and a half, many late into the night. And every time, while I had access to my panel, to the remote inputs, outputs, or the IOs, we were seeking verification from Dave and Roger, the project manager and supervisor from ESSO. But the trick was they didn't rely on luck either. In fact, they didn't rely on me and they didn't rely on my panel. They had positioned experienced rig operators with radios at each piece of equipment controlled by my code. And as we ran through the test scripts, they personally verified all the control sequences. They were confirmed over the radio. So as Dave and I and Roger hovered over the screen and we saw the red or the green lights flashing as valve, pumps and relays opened or closed, we'd get the same confirmation or otherwise back from the rig from experienced operators stationed at equipment with radios. That was verification. And if you think about it, it was part of a carefully orchestrated plan, brief, execute, debrief, feedback loop that we devised as part of the lead up to flying out to Mackerel. Just remember the fighter pilots, they report nearly 100% success using the same methodology. You know, I remember I'm sitting on Mackerel in the mess with Dave and Roger, replaying the day's commissioning activities and sketching out the plan for tomorrow that we'd brief with the rig operators in the morning before heading to stations for execution. Never assume anything will go to plan. Don't follow up once or twice. Make it 3 times for safety. That's the approach we took in Bass Strait. And the other thing I'd say is go in search of data points. The more the better. Back then we used operators stationed at pumps, valves and relays with radios, as well as keen eyes trained on the operator screens, which is what we were doing. And you know what? It actually worked. So my advice is always, in a delivery context, follow up, follow up, follow up. Okay, we'll be back again next week where the story course on Mackerel will continue. In the meantime, as I always say, we're at all the usual places, so feel free to give us any feedback. Love to get it from you. We'll see you next week. Bye for now.